So this is how I'm going to be doing attendance checks in the future, just because it is much easier. This will give me basically a computerized list, which then I match it up with the clicker IDs that are in the toolkit. Please make sure you register in the toolkit. I mean, if your clicker ID is not registered in the toolkit as of this morning, that's not a problem. But please make sure you do register the IDs in the toolkit. Okay. Yes, UVA did win by something like 30 points, and the answer to 5 was it was basketball. Okay. Most people are here. So, I'm told that this was the last slide that was talked about last time. And Professor Horton went over a couple examples as to various methods. And I wanted to spend some time finishing up that particular part of this slide set. And then we're going to move into talking about parameters and variable scoping. So, remember what a return value is. Given some method or some class, notice that we have a, wait, let me get my ink color set. Notice that we have some method call, and for now we're not saying class.method or object.method. We're going to get into that in a bit. But we have some method call, and what we're doing is we're trying to assign the value from that method call to something else. Basically, we've created a string variable called course name, and we want to assign to course name whatever's on the right side. On the right side is a method call. And the method call goes through, and at some point, we will hit a return statement. What a return statement does is it takes whatever between the return keyword and the semicolon, in this case, the value in the reference name, and it's going to take that and copy that back into whatever method it was called from. So essentially, as far as Java is concerned, oops. No, I think that was the wrong button. As far as Java is concerned, because in the getCourse method we have a return value, Java looks at the right side of that equal sign in the main method and says, that's what that value is. And that's going to get copied into the course name reference. So showing a, if we were to actually run it, we call getCourse, Java knows to start executing the getCourse method. String name equals cs101. That does the same 4 things that we always do whenever we start creating an object. It creates the reference, it creates the object, makes the reference point to the object, and calls a constructor. But in particular, notice that there is both the reference and the object. The next line says return name. What is in name is a memory address or a reference to a given object sitting in memory somewhere. So the value in name, some memory address, we have no idea what it is, and really we don't really care. That value is copied back into the course name reference. So at various points in the program, there's a total of 2 references that point to the object. The name, within the method, we had the name reference that pointed to that given object. And now back in the main method, we have the course name reference that pointed to that given object. So then when we print out course name, it's going to print out the particular object that course name points to, which is the object that was created inside our method getCourse. And all of this is done because the return here copies that value into course name. Whether it's return 7, if you're returning an int value, or return an actual reference to an object, such as here, the value in name gets copied into course name. Right, well, I'm going to actually skip that because I have a lot I want to get to today. So the question becomes, what happens if you try changing a parameter? So here we have a new method called changeValue. It takes in a single integer parameter called x, and what it does is it tries to change that value to something else. And then, of course, we have the main method. It says int y equals 5. We call change value y, and we try to print out y. And the question, of course, is whether or not the value that's printed out on the third line of the main method is the original value here, 5, or the updated value, 7. Nope. Yep. So going through a trace of this, first it creates y, which is a variable 5. It's going to call change value with that particular method, which then executes, of course, this entire thing. And then it tries to print this out. And as it turns out, it's going to still print out 5. Even though at some point in the execution, the value was changed to 7, this still prints out 5 for reasons I'm going to get to in a second. Question? Question? Okay. The reason is, Java is what's called a pass-by-value method. There's 3 or 4 ways to pass parameters in programming languages. Java uses what's called pass-by-value. It's pass-by-reference, pass-by-name, I think it's pass-by-symbol table, a couple others. But the important thing to remember is that a copy of the parameter is passed into the method. And this is very important to keep in mind. If you remember nothing else from this whole slide or generally this talk, keep in mind that the parameter that's passed in, when you call the method, a copy is sent to the method. So anything that's modified is then the copy of the parameter, and the original remains left intact. And actually a lot of this, I have a couple demos and a couple other things that I'm going to talk about that actually go over this particular pass-by value. So I'm going to spend a lot of time sort of developing this and going over it. So if a method tries to modify it, such as the method on the previous slide, what gets modified is the copy. When the method finishes, the copy is forgotten about, and the original one is what is then used later on. So any change to a parameter is only visible inside that method. Once the method finishes, and on the previous slide, the change value method, once that finishes, the fact that it changed x to 7 is completely forgotten about. Right, there are other types that are used, parameter passing types. We don't really care about them in this course. We only care about pass by value. Yes?
So if that method that we were looking at before, if it wasn't a void and if it was an int, and at the end of the program we did return x, then would that have changed the value of y?
If we were to say, so let me go back. So the question that she had asked is if we did here, so let's say we change this to an int, and here we put in return x, and here we said x equals, no, I'm sorry, that would be a y equals change value y. Is that the question you're asking?
No, if we had just done, oh, well, yeah.
Okay. So in that case, what would happen as far as Java is concerned is when partly this is going to be a somewhat confusing example just because it's using the variable y for 2 things. But what's happening here is that, well, Java wouldn't see the change being modified to y at that point because Java doesn't modify parameters. This would still return 7, right? Because x is 7. Can't see it when I point to my tablet. X is 7, and then it's going to return the value in x, which is 7. And then that would get copied into y. So in that case, yes, y would be changed, but that's because it's changed by a return value, not by a modification of a parameter. Okay. And again, I'm going to spend a lot of time developing this a bit later in this lecture. So if it's actually, let me just ask by a quick raise of hands. How many people feel they understand changing values in parameters? Okay. I'm not seeing many hands, and that's totally fine. I have a demo and a couple other things that I'm going to talk about. But parameters in general, other than the sort of changing values, parameters in general, how do you think we're doing? How do you think you're doing? It's a bit lower than I'd hoped, but as I said, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about parameters in the rest of this. So I want to mention briefly something called variable scoping. And what a variable scope is, when you scope something out, you check it out visually, right? Or a submarine would send up a scope to look at things above the surface. So variable scoping has to deal with at what point in the program is the variable visible. So for example, let's look at this particular class. Now, some of the things we kind of haven't seen so well, like how you can just define an object inside a class. But the thing that I want you to keep in mind here is that every variable declared, whether it is this funny declared variable here, a parameter, or something defined inside a method, all of them are considered to be inside some sort of block, right? This y at the bottom is considered inside the block of the main method. That block starts at the curly bracket and ends at the curly bracket. This int x here is also considered to be defined within that particular block. Whenever that method is executing, int x can be used. This int z at the top is considered to be within this block, because that's the set of curly braces that it is visible in. So anytime you declare a variable, you can specify what block is that variable declared in. And it turns out that that is the block where the variable is visible. So for example, that int z is declared within the scoping class, and it's visible anywhere within the class. Meaning it's visible inside this method, it's visible inside that method, anywhere within its particular declared block, you can use that. You can print it out, you can change its value, etc., etc. Here, that particular int x is declared within the block that starts at the beginning of the foo method and ends at the end of the foo method. And that particular variable, or in this case a parameter, is visible anywhere within the foo method. So inside the foo method, I can print it out, I can change its value, I can assign it a value, but I can't, for example, do that within the main method to x. Because in the main method, because this is only visible inside that block or that particular method. Likewise for int y. Int y is defined within this particular block, so it's only visible inside the main method, and specifically after it's been declared. So there, int y can only be used inside the main method. And if I tried using y within var, Java's going to complain because it doesn't know about it. It's only visible inside that particular main method.
So would you have to redeclare each successive method you open up?
Redeclare.
Like if you have x in the void method, could you redeclare it in the main method?
So the question is, if you have int x in the foo method, would you have to redeclare it in the main method? If you wanted to use another integer variable x in the main method, yes, you could declare it again. But Java would see them as different. It would, you could, for example, say int x right there.
Even if you assign it the same value?
Yes, Java still sees them as two separate variables. So this is an example of when you can have two variables that have the same name. As far as Java is concerned, there's an x that is inside the foo method, and there is now an x that is inside the main method, and Java looks at them differently. There are going to be different positions inside in memory. And Java will never get them mixed up, because if you're talking about x within the main method, then Java knows exactly which one you mean. And if you're talking about it within the foo method, Java knows exactly which one you mean. I saw another hand up. Yes, no, maybe, yes.
Okay, so if we're changing like the value of int z inside one of the methods, then is the change permanent? Like when we're moving on to like the next method or something?
So the question was, if I said z equals 7 here, so as far as Java is concerned, at this point there's only one z. Whenever you run this, no matter how the execution goes, there's only one z. So if I set z equal to 7 here, and later I print z, and imagine I could actually spell print, then yes, that would print 7. So that value is remembered. As far as Java is concerned, there's only one Z variable. And that variable can be used in any of those methods. And if you set it in one of the methods, you can then use it in any of the other methods.
So this is unlike that previous example where we were trying to change the value of y.
Yes, it's different than the previous example.
I know that if you have a variable that you want to make available to the entire program, it's easier to program it inside a code. Is there a trick to make it available to the whole program, even though it's inside a code?
The question had to do with how do you make what's called the global variable, which is a variable visible to the entire program. This is one way to make a global variable, which is a variable visible to the entire program. V can be seen anywhere inside the scoping class. You can set it in foo, you can print it in var, you can read it within main, anything that you want. There are other ways to create global variables. We're actually going to start seeing that next week. Okay. How are we doing with scoping? Okay, I'm actually pretty happy with that. That's high. I mean, being as I only went over it for one slide, that was meant just as an introduction. That's actually much better than I thought it would be. Again, we're going to be seeing scoping reinforced over the next couple lectures as well. So, if I was to summarize all the stuff that you need to know about methods, if you are sticking methods in a class, you can stick them in any order. Java couldn't care less about the order. This is different than other languages, C++, for example, where the order does matter. Here, Java doesn't care. If you call a method that's listed later in the class, Java's smart, it'll figure it out. In particular, it's different than C and C++. You have to do some sort of funky stuff if you want to call them out of order. All methods must specify a return type. That's the type of value returned. The cosine method in the math class has a double return type because it returns a double value, 0.5, 1.7, although how you get 1.7 from a cosine is kind of odd. In particular, if your method doesn't return or you don't need it to return a value, such as the print line method, that does not return a value, then you just say it's void. So void is kind of a primitive type, but not really. Parameters cannot be changed within a method, and we're going to spend the next section in the slides that actually talks about that. But as we're going to see, the objects that the parameters point to can actually be changed. Okay. Any questions on methods? So this is the last of the Ig Nobel Prizes that I wanted to talk about. Again, these are the prizes that are awarded about the week before the Nobel Prizes in December-ish. And every year they come up with slightly different categories. So architecture, agricultural history, the significance of Mr. Richard Buckley's exploding trousers. That was an article published. Physics, the pitch drop experiment started in 1927. There was a big debate as to whether or not pitch, which is like the tar that's used on roofs, is liquid or solid. So they put this pitch in basically this big funnel, and they're watching how it drips. And this is actually the longest running experiment. It turns out it is a liquid, but it drips like once a decade or something like that. So it's like extremely viscous. Medicine. So when you neuter your male dog, apparently some people feel like the dogs have somewhat of a complex. So what you can do is you can get nudicles, which actually come in 3 different sizes, and they're essentially artificial replacement testicles, and you can make your dog look like he never got neutered in the first place. Literature. So I'm sure many of you have seen the nice scams that are coming that basically say that somebody has all this money, they just want to give it to you. They need to get it out of a foreign country. It's started with, it's most often Nigeria, but you know, that happens in Iraq and Iran, various places. And they just need a couple transfer fees to give you like $10 million. And these are all scams. And the scary thing is people have wasted so much money on these. This is actually like the third most grossing industry in terms of revenue in Nigeria. There's stories people lost like $2 million of their boss's money, no less, through these things. Of course, once it gets transferred to Nigeria in cash, well, you can't trace it. They're now doing similar things with, there's a roommate scam, where somebody, from a foreign country is trying to find a roommate, so they send you this big check, and they send it to you very quickly. They send this big check to you for like 6 months of rent, and they say, what you need to do is cash it and then send me the money in cash. So people go and cash the check and then wire the money. The check later bounces, and the person now has wired the money, so they can't get it back, and they're out like $4,000. There's a great article about it in Seaville of Hook this week. Peace. So what they did is they studied locusts, which are grasshoppers, made them watch Star Wars, and did brain scans of them.
What were the results of
I don't know. I'm not. So there are two questions. What does that have to do with peace? I don't know. What were the results? I don't know that either. Economics. There's this alarm clock that's cylindrical, and basically when it starts ringing, it rolls away. So in addition to getting up and slapping the thing, you have to then run under your bed to get it. Chemistry. Will humans swim faster or slower in syrup? Biology. For cataloging the odors of 131 different frogs that are under stress. Yeah. Nutrition. This one gentleman in Japan cataloged and analyzed every meal he has eaten for 34 years straight. Like photographs and a very detailed list of everything he's eaten. And fluid dynamics, an article entitled "Pressures Produced When Penguins Poo, Calculations on Avian Defecation." And who says research isn't fun or interesting? Okay. So let's talk about parameter passing in a bit more detail. So we have this methods class, methods 5, and this is what we saw before. And what's happening here, my cough drop. So what's happening here is we set y equals to 5. Y is then passed in as the parameter to the change value method. The change value method tries to modify it, and then we print it out. So, blah, blah, blah. Y is equal to 5. Poof, we now have a y variable called 5. Or int variable called y with value 5. When we call change value y, what happens at that point, so remember Java is pass by value, which means it's going to copy it. It then starts executing the change value method, but it copies the value in y into a variable called x. We now have two copies of the exact same value, x and y. It says x equal to 7. Notice that we're setting x equal to 7. We're not setting y equal to 7. So now my x is going to change to 7. This method finishes. There's no return statement, but if you hit the end of a method, it counts as an automatic return statement. It finishes. Once the method finishes, the x variable is forgotten about. Because it was a parameter to that method, it's instantiated or created when the method starts, right? We copied the value y into the parameter x. And when the method finishes, it totally gets rid of that value. Now we're going to print out y, and you'll notice that y is unchanged. It's whatever it was previously. So what gets printed then is still 5. The value is completely unchanged because what happened when we called the method is the copy got modified, not the original. And here we're trying to print out the original. So 5 is printed. Right, program demo, I'm going to skip. And this is the slide that you saw about 5 slides ago, pretty much the same thing. I'm just using it as an intro to this section as well. Okay, so consider this. This is now methods 6. Here my change value now takes in a rectangle object. And that's my main method. I now create a rectangle object, I call change value with that rectangle object, and then I try to print out the width. So let's go through a trace of this. Right? Rectangle rect equals new rectangle 1, 2. That does the four things that we're used to doing. It creates a reference, it creates the object, makes a reference point to the object, and it calls the parameter. In this case, the parameter it calls the constructor, the one that has two parameters, a width and a height. So we now have this rectangle, which probably has some other properties, color, line thickness, position. We only care about width and height for this slide. I call change value rect. Remember what happens when I'm calling a method is I'm going to copy the parameter. So I'm going to start that particular method as well and copy the parameter, copy rect into R. The thing to keep in mind is that what's actually in rect is a reference. Rect is a reference that happens to point to an object somewhere. So this rect is going to get copied into R, but what actually gets copied is the reference. So both rect and R are two separate references that just happen to point to the same spot in memory. They point to the same rectangle object that's created. So in that respect, it's I know the fact that we're now dealing with objects instead of primitive types, it's no different than the previous one. I am still copying the value in the parameter over. It just so happens that the value is now a reference. R.setSize 10, 20. When we started R, dot means follow the reference. Set size 10, 20. I'm going to set the size of that of the only rectangle object currently declared in memory to 10, 20. This method finishes, and the parameter, or R, is forgotten about. Notice that the object is still there. Rect still points to that object. And the modifications to the object are still there as well. So now when I print out getWidth, rect, dot means follow the pointer, or follow the reference. GetWidth is going to return 10. So here I made a modification to a parameter inside the method, and the modification stuck. The thing to keep in mind is that the modification was actually not made to the parameter. The modification was made to what the parameter refers to. So that's perfectly allowed, and that's one way that you can make modifications within a method. You're not actually modifying the parameter, you're just modifying what the parameter points to in memory. So this is going to print out 10. I'm going to show a couple of contrasting examples like this as well. Right, and you can run it. Oh. So that's a bit quick, but 2 years ago, one of the students in the class decided to make his own motivators and told me that I could show them in successive classes. Success. If at first you don't succeed, have a TA succeed for you. Did we see these this semester? Okay. Perfection. It will never compile. The sooner you realize that, the sooner you can go back to watching Family Guy. This is Ryan Cassidy 2 years ago. He submitted these. I thought they were pretty entertaining. So, pass by value. Again, Java still pass by value. You're still passing a copy of the parameter. If that copy is a reference, it doesn't really matter. Whether the copy is a primitive type like an int, what we saw initially, versus a reference, Java will still take that and copy that into the parameter in the method. So in that example, the parameter was the reference to the object. The object itself is not what's passed, it's the reference to the object. So we didn't make changes to the reference. The reference at the beginning of the method still pointed to that object, and at the end of the method still pointed to the object. So the actual numerical memory address in that reference never changed. But the data at that memory address did change. So consider this, method 7. Here we have a new change value method. But notice that inside it, we're saying R equals new rectangle 10, 20. And then the main method, right, that's the only change. The main method is just as before. So let's go through a trace of this. Rectangle rect equals new rectangle. That does the four things we talked about. Poof, we have a rect reference pointing to a rectangle object with values 1, 2. Change value rect. I'm going to copy the value in rect, which is a memory address. We have, it doesn't really matter what it is, 1, 2, 3, 4. Whatever is in rect, that memory address is copied into R. And now R points to that same object sitting in memory somewhere. Here I say R equals new rectangle 10, 20. What I am doing is I'm going to say, instead, this is not modifying what R points to, this is modifying R itself. R is assigned a new value, which happens to be some new rectangle in memory. We now have created a second rectangle in memory, and R points to the second rectangle. I have now changed the value inside R. Previously, R was the memory address of the lower object, the 1, 2 rectangle object. After that assignment, R becomes the memory address of the upper rectangle object, the 10, 20 rectangle object. So the actual memory address in R has now been changed. That method finishes. Oh, right, I call a constructor. That method finishes, and R, the parameter, is forgotten about. Java gets rid of it. Now, since nothing pointed to that upper object, it gets garbage collected away. And what happens is that now when I say rex.getWidth, it's going to print out 1. So the thing to keep in mind here is in this example, I have actually modified the parameter in the change value method. Here I'm directly modifying the parameter. Before I was just modifying what the parameter pointed to. And there Java does not, Java discards any changes that were made. So it prints 1. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. How are we doing with parameter passing? Okay. We're getting there. So let's do a slightly different way to demonstrate parameter passing. For this, I need a volunteer, someone who can catch. Can anybody? Great. Come on up. Okay. Sorry. Daniel. Daniel is going to be my change value method. And you know, I actually meant to have signs so we could look complete, or at least I could look completely like fools. I don't have any such signs. Okay, so I am the main method. I have declared a variable y, which has value 5. What I am now going to do is I'm going to call my change value method. And what I'm going to do by doing this is I'm going to copy my value 5 into my variable x. And I'm going to pass my variable x to my change value method. Quick aside, I can't throw this in my life. I can't catch this in my life. So just be ready. Okay, I now have my variable x, and I'm going to pass it to my change value method. He's now going to execute his change value method and change that to a 7. Okay, he now finishes and just discards that. My y is still 5. Okay. Oh, it gets better. So now I have... Yes, we're very advanced here. All right. So now I'm going to create a rectangle. And this rectangle, imagine it's an actual rectangle, is 1, 2. I'm going to say this is an address 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the particular address that happens to be on. So what I do is I create my rectangle object. This is now my rex variable. It has address 1, 2, 3, 4, which is a reference to some spot in memory. That spot in memory just happens to be this on the board. you're going to need these props, by the way,
Wait,
in a minute.
One frisbee is just the name, and the other one actually.
This is the actual variable inside the main. This is my rect reference that I've created. So normally I would do rect and then a box. Well, imagine this is rect in a circle now. So this is the actual reference that I've created. It's a spot in memory that has the memory address that's sitting up here on the board. Now I'm going to call my change value method. And what I do is I'm going to copy that. I'm going to copy that value and throw it to my method. He now has, so this is my rect, that, if you hold that up, that's R, which is the parameter to the change value method. He now does what the change value method tells him to do and modifies the object that happens to, that's pointing to. Great, thank you. He then does the same thing he did on the previous one and then just discards that parameter. I now have my original rect reference, which is still pointing to the same spot in memory. Notice that he never changed that rect reference, and it certainly was not changed here, but the value at that spot in memory was changed. So now this rectangle object in memory has width 10 and height 20, or height 10 and width 20, but 10, 20.
So because he's never changed the original value, can you send it over to him as many times as you want for different purposes?
Yes. The question was, I mean, you can send, I could call him as many times as I have frisbees, essentially. I could just keep tossing him frisbees.
In order for the change value method to work, you need to return R.
Come back. This change value method doesn't have a return, but we're not talking about return values here. So the change value method has a return type of void.
Oh, the board.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question. The previous one just tried, it was a primitive type as the value, and it tried directly modifying the primitive, the actual parameter. This one doesn't actually try modifying the parameter, but instead modifies what the parameter points to, which is not, both of our references happen to point to that same object in space, but he modified what his reference pointed to, not the reference itself.
So for the previous one, for modifying the primitive type, can you modify it from like an int to a Boolean variable or vice versa?
The question was, can you modify a primitive type to a different type, like an int to a Boolean? And no, Java will complain about that.
But this is just to demonstrate parameter passing. There is no actual point, no way to do this in the programming in real life itself.
I'm not sure what the question is.
Is there a point to programming this way in real life?
Oh, the question was, why is Java, if I could paraphrase, why is Java set up this way? Why does it do this with parameter passing? Let me get back to that in a week or two. As we're going to see, parameter passing set up this way actually makes things a bit saner in the long run. Okay, does this example make sense? Yes? Okay, I'm seeing some heads modified. So, if I can have this, wait, we're not finished yet. Hold on, I got to confer with my method for a second. Okay, so now that I've conferred with my method, I'm going to go over the last example that I showed you. And again, it's going to be similar in that I have now created a rectangle that has values 1, 2. That happens to be, so this is my reference, my actual spot in memory where I have the memory address. 0x1234. However, it does memory addresses, doesn't really matter. At that particular spot in address is this object with values 1, 2. I want to call my method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my parameter. That wasn't passed. You didn't see that. I'm going to copy the value in my parameter. The value in my rect reference is that address. So I'm going to copy that into R, and I'm going to pass it to my method. My method is now going to create a brand new object. And the method creates a brand new object in memory at some new memory address, 0x5678. And we have a new rectangle that has values 10, 20. Notice that my method, if he holds up the new value in his parameter, it's now 5678. He has directly modified the parameter that I sent in. In the previous one, he did it. He modified what it pointed to. This time, he created a new object and made his reference point to that new object. When he's finished with his change value method, he just discards it just as above, just as the previous examples. Keep in mind that when the reference is discarded, Java will garbage collect that away, and we have the original object still sitting in memory, and my reference still points to the original object with the original values. Let's thank the change value method, aka Daniel. All right. Did that help? So, I found places to get really, really cheap Frisbees because I go play fetch with my dog and she loves Frisbees or tennis balls or anything that she can fetch. And I figured I shouldn't go get like, a $10 Frisbee because it's just going to get chewed up anyway. So these are like the PetSmart 99-cent Frisbees, which is why they fly so straight. I suppose the fact that I weighted it down with paper probably doesn't help either. You didn't see that. I can do certain sports, but like anything that requires me to catch a ball is just not happening. Or if it's like offset from my hand with like a tennis racket or a baseball bat, like I can do, dancing, martial arts, running, stuff that doesn't require that sort of arm-hand coordination. Okay, wait, before you leave. So we're getting much better. You'll note, actually, from 2 slides ago to this one, so I feel the demo actually did something, which is pretty exciting. But I want to properly demotivate. Sit down. I have like 60 seconds. I want to properly demotivate you for St. Patrick's Day. Ignorance. It's amazing how much easier it is for a team to work together when no one has any idea where they're going. Indifference. It takes 43 muscles to frown and 17 to smile, but doesn't take any to just sit there with a dumb look on your face. Get to work. You've seen this before. You aren't being paid to believe in the power of your dreams. This is the one on the first midterm. Change. It's a short trip from riding the waves of change to being torn apart by the jaws of defeat. Have a great St. Patrick's Day.